There's something transformative about seeing history in color. When we watch black and white footage from World War II, our minds register it as something distant, something that happened in another era entirely. But color does something different to our perception. It collapses that distance. Suddenly, the faces staring back at us from the summer of 1941 or 1942 become startlingly real, and we're reminded that these weren't figures from some ancient past, but people who lived and breathed and experienced the world in the same vivid spectrum that we do today. The footage we're examining comes from a remarkable collection captured by German propaganda photographers who ventured into the Eastern Territories armed with Agfa-color film, a pioneering color film technology developed by the German company Agfa in 1936. While the vast majority of war documentation was shot in black and white, a select few cameramen had access to this rare and expensive color stock. Their mission was clear: document the German Wehrmacht's advance through the Soviet Union in a way that would inspire the home front and demonstrate German superiority. What they captured, however, tells a far more complex story than they intended. This isn't just footage of military operations. These frames preserve glimpses of a massive undertaking that would ultimately involve more men, tanks, guns, and aircraft than had ever been committed to a single offensive in human history. They show us the faces of soldiers caught in one of the most consequential campaigns of the Second World War, a campaign that would fundamentally alter the course of the conflict and shape the world we live in today. Through these rare color images, we can witness the German advance through the Soviet Union, not as abstract military history, but as a human experience painted in all its complexity, ambition, brutality, and ultimately, tragedy. The Pact and the Breaking. Seeds of Barbarossa. To understand the invasion of the Soviet Union, we need to step back to August 1939. When the world watched in shock as two ideological enemies stunned everyone by signing a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as it became known, promised 10 years of peace between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. To casual observers, this seemed like an unlikely alliance. To anyone who had read Hitler's writings, however, it was clearly a temporary arrangement. In his 1925 manifesto, Mein Kampf, Hitler had laid out his vision with brutal clarity. He believed Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, and that this space would be found in the East. He viewed the Slavic peoples as inferior, the Soviet system as a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, and the vast territories of Russia as Germany's destiny. The pact with Stalin was never anything more than a tactical move, a way to secure Germany's eastern border while dealing with Poland and France. Hitler's generals may have had doubts about fighting on two fronts, but Hitler himself never wavered in his conviction that the Soviet Union would be his ultimate target. By the summer of 1940, with France defeated and Britain isolated, Hitler turned his attention eastward. The preliminary planning began in July, and on December 18, 1940, Hitler issued Führer Directive 21, officially launching the preparations for what would be codenamed Operation Barbarossa, after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had sought to establish German dominance in Europe centuries earlier. The plan was audacious in its scope. Germany would mobilize more than 3.8 million Axis troops along a 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Supporting them would be some 3,150 tanks, 600,000 motor vehicles, and crucially, about 750,000 horses. The German High Command, still riding high on the swift victories in Poland and France, believed they could defeat the Soviet Union in a matter of months. The plan called for three massive army groups. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad, Army Group Center would aim for Moscow, and Army Group South would push through Ukraine toward the resource-rich regions beyond. The Germans had convinced themselves that the Soviet Union was, as Hitler put it, a rotten structure that would collapse once they kicked in the door. Soviet losses in the Winter War against Finland had seemed to confirm German assumptions about Red Army incompetence. What the Germans failed to fully appreciate was the sheer scale of what they were attempting, the distances involved, the Soviet Union's industrial capacity, and the resilience of a people fighting for their homeland. They also underestimated Stalin's ability to mobilize his population for total war, despite the purges that had gutted the Red Army's officer corps in the late 1930s. June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in history. In the early morning darkness of June 22, 1941, the largest military operation in human history began to unfold. Along that vast front, stretching nearly 2,000 miles, more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers moved forward. Artillery opened up with a barrage that shook the earth, while the Luftwaffe launched thousands of sorties, catching much of the Soviet Air Force on the ground. Despite numerous warnings from various intelligence sources, including British intelligence and even a Soviet spy in Tokyo, Stalin had refused to believe that Hitler would break the pact so soon. He had forbidden defensive preparations, fearing they might provoke the Germans. The result was catastrophic for the Soviet Union. The initial German advance seemed to validate every optimistic assumption the Wehrmacht had made. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, employed classic blitzkrieg tactics with devastating effectiveness. Panzer spearheads punched through Soviet defenses, raced deep into enemy territory, and then wheeled around to encircle massive formations of Soviet troops before they could retreat. At Minsk, just 6 days into the invasion, German forces had already captured 300,000 Soviet prisoners. At Smolensk in late July, another 300,000 Red Army soldiers fell into German hands. The scale of Soviet losses in these opening months defies easy comprehension. By the end of 1941, more than 3 million Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured. Entire Soviet armies simply ceased to exist. German forces captured vast quantities of equipment, occupied huge swaths of territory, including Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and pushed to within sight of Moscow itself. German newsreels showed endless columns of Soviet prisoners marching westward, and the mood in German headquarters was jubilant. But beneath the surface of these stunning tactical victories, problems were already emerging. The very success of the German advance was stretching supply lines to the breaking point. Those 600,000 motor vehicles the Germans had started with were breaking down on the primitive Soviet road network. The Luftwaffe, while dominant in the air, was operating from airfields hundreds of miles behind the advancing troops. And perhaps most critically, the Soviet Union wasn't collapsing. Despite staggering losses, new Soviet units kept appearing. Factories were being relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers. The Red Army was learning, adapting, and most importantly, not surrendering. By mid-July 1941, German forces had advanced more than 400 miles and stood just 200 miles from Moscow. The road to the Soviet capital seemed open. But then, Hitler made a decision that would haunt the German campaign. He ordered a delay in the Moscow offensive, insisting instead that Army Group Center's mobile forces be diverted south to complete the encirclement of Soviet forces in Ukraine. His generals protested, arguing that Moscow was the prize, that taking it would cripple Soviet command and control. Hitler overruled them, focusing on economic targets and the destruction of Soviet armies rather than capturing the capital. This argument would drag on through August, precious weeks slipping away as the German offensive lost momentum and summer turned toward autumn. The human face of war, through the lens. This is where those color images become so valuable. Among the thousands of photographers documenting the German war effort, a select few had access to Agfacolor new film stock. This pioneering color film, introduced in 1936, was expensive and relatively rare. Most went to prestige propaganda projects, but some found its way into the hands of military cameramen following the advancing armies. These photographers were part of the Propaganda Companion, specialized propaganda units embedded with combat forces. Their job was to create images that would support the Nazi narrative, to show German strength and Soviet weakness, to build morale on the home front and demonstrate the righteousness of the German cause. What's fascinating is that even with this propagandistic intent, the footage they captured often reveals truths they didn't intend to document. The technology itself tells us something about the German war effort. Agfacolor used a single-strip 3-layer process that was technically superior to Kodachrome in some ways, particularly because it could be processed more easily. But it was still expensive and required careful handling. The fact that the Germans allocated any of this precious resource to battlefield photography speaks to the importance they placed on visual propaganda. Hitler himself had proclaimed after seeing Agfacolor images that the future belongs to color photography. When we look at this footage today, we see things the cameraman may not have intended us to notice. Yes, there are the expected shots of German soldiers advancing, of tanks rolling across vast plains, of destroyed Soviet equipment. But there are also quieter moments. We see soldiers gathered around field kitchens, eating their rations. We glimpse the weariness in their eyes, even in the early months when victory seemed assured. We notice how they huddle together for warmth as autumn approaches, how the landscape seems to stretch endlessly in every direction. The color brings an intimacy that black and white footage lacks. We can see the dust on their uniforms, the different shades of green and gray in their equipment, the actual hues of the Russian landscape, from the golden wheat fields of Ukraine to the darker forests of the north. We see smoke rising from burning villages in authentic oranges and blacks, not the abstracted grays of monochrome. The faces of Soviet prisoners become individuals, not just masses. A young soldier looks directly at the camera, and across 8 decades we can read the uncertainty in his expression. These images also capture the landscape itself, the terrain that would become such a crucial factor in the campaign's outcome. The open steppes, beautiful in the summer light, but offering no shelter from the elements. The few roads, often nothing more than dirt tracks. The small villages, their wooden buildings simple and scattered. The immense sky that seems to dwarf everything beneath it. This is the Russia that German soldiers encountered, a land of vast spaces that German logistics would struggle to overcome. The terrain and the enemy. Russia fights. Back for soldiers accustomed to the relatively compact geography of Western Europe, Russia was a profound shock. As General Hasso von Manteuffel would later recall, the spaces seemed endless, the horizon nebulous. The Wehrmacht had fought in France, where a dense road network allowed for rapid movement and resupply. In Russia, there were precious few roads, and those that existed were primitive by Western standards. One German engineer noted that by September, these roads had already turned into muddy tracks, nothing like the solid infrastructure they had relied upon in France. The sheer scale created problems the German planning had not adequately addressed. An officer might look at a map and see that Moscow was only 200 miles away, but those 200 miles bore no resemblance to 200 miles in France or Poland. The distances consumed fuel, wore out vehicles, exhausted men, and stretched supply lines to the breaking point. A panzer division that raced forward in a brilliant tactical maneuver might find itself immobilized days later, waiting for fuel trucks that were struggling hundreds of miles to the rear. The Germans had planned for a blitzkrieg, a lightning war that would be over in weeks. They had not planned for the sustained, grinding campaign that Russia demanded. As they pushed deeper into Soviet territory, they found that every kilometer gained made the next kilometer harder to hold. The horse-drawn supply wagons that constituted the bulk of German logistics simply couldn't keep pace with mechanized warfare across such distances. And then there was the enemy. The Red Army of June 1941 was poorly led, caught by surprise, and suffered from the effects of Stalin's purges. But it was also enormous, drawing on a population that dwarfed Germany's, and it was learning fast. Soviet commanders who survived the initial disasters began to understand how to counter German tactics. They adopted a strategy of trading space for time, falling back rather than allowing themselves to be encircled, forcing the Germans to pursue them ever deeper into Russian territory. The fighting itself was more brutal than anything the Germans had experienced in the West. Soviet soldiers, fighting for their homeland and aware of how the Germans treated prisoners and civilians, often fought with desperate determination. Stories circulated among German troops about wounded soldiers being found with their heads split open after Soviet counterattacks. Whether accurate or exaggerated, such accounts hardened German attitudes and contributed to a vicious cycle of atrocity and retaliation. By December 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow. They could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars, but they couldn't take that final step. Fresh Soviet divisions, many from Siberia, began to arrive. These troops were equipped for winter fighting, while the Germans were still largely in their summer uniforms. On December 5, 1941, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back over 200 miles. For the first time in World War II, the Wehrmacht had been decisively defeated. The Blitzkrieg had failed. General Winter, the frozen nightmare. If one image could capture the German experience in Russia during the winter of 1941-42, it would be of soldiers wrapped in whatever they could find, newspapers stuffed into their uniforms for insulation, standing guard in temperatures that plunged to 30 or 40 degrees below 0 Celsius. The cold became an enemy as deadly as the Red Army. The Germans had planned to defeat the Soviet Union before winter arrived. When that plan failed and they found themselves facing a Russian winter unprepared, the consequences were catastrophic. By the end of 1941, over 100,000 cases of frostbite had been reported, resulting in nearly 15,000 limb amputations. Men lost fingers, toes, ears, noses to the brutal cold. Some froze to death at their posts, but it wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. The cold crippled German equipment. Tanks and trucks refused to start, their engines frozen solid. Lubricants turned to sludge, guns and artillery pieces froze and malfunctioned. The Luftwaffe found its aircraft grounded, unable to provide the air support that had been so crucial to German success. Horses, those hundreds of thousands of horses that the German army still relied on, died by the thousands, further disrupting supply lines. The Soviets, by contrast, were prepared. They had winter clothing, equipment designed to function in extreme cold, and most importantly, experience. They knew how to operate in these conditions. Soviet tanks used specialized winter lubricants. Soviet soldiers wore quilted jackets and felt boots. When German forces were immobilized by the cold, Soviet ski troops could continue to maneuver and attack. And yet, winter was only part of the year's weather challenges. Before the freeze came the Rasputitsa, the mud season. In October and November, autumn rains turned the primitive Russian roads into bottomless quagmires. Trucks sank up to their axles. Horses struggled and died trying to pull wagons through the muck. Entire divisions became stuck, unable to advance or retreat. One German officer recorded that within hours of the rain starting, all movements of wheeled vehicles became extremely difficult. The Rasputitsa would return in spring, when the winter snow melted and created the same impossible conditions. The Germans learned that Russia had only two brief windows for mobile operations, the dry months of summer and the frozen weeks of deep winter when the ground was hard. The rest of the time, Russia's landscape itself fought against them. These weather conditions also impacted morale in ways that are hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. German soldiers had been told they were fighting a short campaign. They had expected to be home before winter. Instead, they found themselves in a frozen wasteland, cut off from supplies, wondering if they would survive to see another spring. Letters home became increasingly somber. The confidence of the summer months gave way to a grim determination, and in some cases, despair. 1942, a new gamble in the South. After the failure to take Moscow and the brutal winter that followed, the German army needed time to recover and refit. But Hitler wasn't interested in a defensive posture. By April 1942, he had formulated a new plan, one that would focus on the southern sector of the front, where he believed Germany could achieve a decisive victory. The plan was called Operation Blue, or Case Blue, and its objectives were both military and economic. Hitler wanted to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, particularly those around Baku in Azerbaijan. Germany's war machine ran on oil, and while the synthetic fuel programs helped, they couldn't fully meet the Wehrmacht's needs. Capturing the Caucasus oil fields would solve Germany's fuel problems while simultaneously denying those resources to the Soviets. It was, Hitler believed, essential. He told his generals that if he didn't get the oil of Maykop and Grozny, he would have to liquidate the war. But the plan had a critical flaw built into it from the start. Rather than maintaining a single, powerful thrust toward the Caucasus, Hitler divided his forces. Army Group South was split into two parts. Army Group South A, under Wilhelm List, would drive toward the Caucasus and the oil fields. Army Group South B, which included the 6th Army under Friedrich Paulus and the 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth, would move east toward the Volga River and a city called Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was one of the Wehrmacht's premier formations, numbering over 250,000 men at full strength. It had distinguished itself in the invasions of Poland and France and the opening months of Barbarossa. As it began its advance on June 28, 1942, many of its soldiers believed this would be the campaign that finally broke Soviet resistance. One soldier, Wilhelm Hoffmann, wrote in his diary that they would soon reach the Volga, take Stalingrad, and then the war would be over. The initial advance seemed to confirm these hopes. German forces rolled across the open steppes of southern Russia, covering ground rapidly. Unlike the previous year, the Soviets were now more willing to retreat rather than be encircled, which meant the Germans captured fewer prisoners but also faced less resistance. By late July, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles, but protecting the flanks of this advance were not German troops but Allied formations, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units. These allies were not as well equipped, trained, or led as their German counterparts, and German commanders knew it. The plan was for them to hold static defensive positions while the Germans conducted mobile operations. It was a plan that looked good on paper, but contained within it the seeds of catastrophe. As Army Group South B pushed eastward, the distances involved and the division of forces began to tell. The two army groups were diverging, creating a gap between them. Supply lines were stretching, and increasingly, Hitler's attention became focused not on the oil fields that were the stated objective of the campaign, but on Stalingrad itself. The drive to Stalingrad. Summer into autumn. Stalingrad wasn't supposed to be the main objective. In the original plans for Case Blue, it was mentioned only in passing as a city that should be neutralized to protect the flank of forces advancing into the Caucasus. But as the summer of 1942 progressed, Stalingrad became increasingly important to Hitler, partly for its symbolic value as the city bearing Stalin's name, partly for its industrial significance as a major producer of tanks and tractors, and partly because of its strategic position on the Volga River. The Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad on August 23, 1942. That same day, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most devastating aerial bombardments of the war. Over 1,000 aircraft dropped bombs on the city in wave after wave, killing thousands of civilians and setting much of Stalingrad ablaze. The attack turned large sections of the city into a landscape of rubble and ruins. German forces expected that this bombardment would break Soviet resistance and allow them to capture the city quickly. Instead, they found themselves facing one of the most determined defensive stands of the war. The Soviet 62nd Army, under General Vasily Chuikov, resolved to defend Stalingrad street by street, building by building, room by room if necessary. Chuikov developed tactics specifically designed for urban combat, ordering his men to hug the Germans, staying so close to enemy forces that German air support and artillery couldn't be used without risking friendly fire. What followed was a type of warfare that the German army, for all its battlefield experience, was ill-suited for. The Blitzkrieg, with its emphasis on speed and maneuver, was useless in the rubble of Stalingrad. Instead, combat became a grinding, close-quarters nightmare. German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. One young officer bitterly described fighting for 15 days for control of a single house, with the front line reduced to a corridor between burnt-out rooms. The city's geography made the fighting even more brutal. Stalingrad stretched along the western bank of the Volga River for over 20 miles but was less than 3 miles wide at its broadest point. This narrow strip of urban terrain became a killing ground. The northern part of the city was dominated by huge industrial complexes, the Red October metallurgical plant, the Barakati gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. These massive structures, with their thick walls and maze-like interiors, became fortresses that had to be taken room by room, floor by floor. In the center of the city rose Mamayev Kurgan, an ancient burial mound that provided commanding views of the surrounding area. Control of this hill changed hands multiple times in savage fighting. In the south stood a massive grain elevator, a concrete fortress that Soviet defenders held for weeks, despite being surrounded and cut off. As September turned to October and October to November, the Sixth Army bled itself white in this urban meat grinder. German infantry divisions were reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Pioneer engineer units, tasked with clearing the city block by block, were essentially annihilated. The panzer forces that had once been the terror of Europe were reduced to immobile strongpoints scattered among the ruins. By mid-November, German forces controlled about 90% of the ruined city. They had pushed the Soviet defenders back to a narrow strip along the Volga, in some places only a few hundred meters deep. Victory seemed within reach, but the Sixth Army was exhausted, strung out along a vast front with exposed flanks protected by those Romanian allies. And the Soviets were planning something. The Cauldron, trapped at Stalingrad. On November 19, 1942, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Soviet artillery opened up along the Romanian positions northwest of Stalingrad. The bombardment was devastating, a furious crescendo of fire that shattered the Romanian defenses. Then came the tanks, waves of Soviet armor that crashed through the broken Romanian lines. Despite fighting bravely, the Romanian Third Army simply didn't have the weapons or training to stop the Soviet assault. The next day, November 20th, a second Soviet offensive launched from the south, again targeting Romanian positions, this time the 4th Romanian Army. The plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was elegant in its simplicity. Two massive pincers would drive toward each other, meeting somewhere behind the German forces in Stalingrad, cutting them off from the rest of the German army. German commanders saw what was happening and began to panic. The Sixth Army had some mobile reserves, but they were either committed to the fighting in Stalingrad or too weak to stop the Soviet advance. Frantic calls went up the chain of command. Some officers urged an immediate breakout while there was still time. But Hitler, over 1,500 miles away in his headquarters, refused to consider retreat. On November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach on the Don River. The Sixth Army was encircled. Trapped in the pocket were approximately 250,000 to 290,000 German and other Axis soldiers, the entire Sixth Army, plus supporting units. They held a pocket of territory roughly 30 miles from east to west and 25 miles from north to south, centered on the ruins of Stalingrad. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, delivering the 300 tons of supplies needed each day. Hitler, eager to believe this was possible, ordered the Sixth Army to hold its position. He promoted Paulus to field marshal, knowing that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The airlift was a disaster from the start. The Luftwaffe had neither the number of aircraft nor the airfields close enough to maintain such a supply effort. The atrocious winter weather frequently grounded the transport planes. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns took an increasing toll. On its best day, the airlift delivered 300 tons. Most days it delivered far less, some days nothing at all. Inside the pocket, conditions rapidly deteriorated. As November turned to December and December to January, temperatures plummeted. Fuel ran short, then ran out entirely in many units. Artillery ammunition was rationed strictly. Food rations were cut again and again. Soldiers began to starve. Disease spread through the crowded, freezing bunkers. Horses were slaughtered for meat until none remained. Then men began eating anything they could find. A relief attempt was launched on December 12th. The 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth tried to break through to the encircled forces. For a few days it seemed possible. The panzers advanced to within 30 miles of the pocket, but Hitler refused to allow the 6th Army to break out to meet them, insisting they hold Stalingrad. Meanwhile, another Soviet offensive threatened to encircle the relief force itself. On December 23rd, the relief attempt was called off. The final Soviet assault to crush the pocket, Operation Ring, began on January 10, 1943. The emaciated, frozen, demoralized German forces fought with desperate determination, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The pocket was methodically reduced. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered what remained of the southern portion of the pocket. 2 days later, on February 2, 1943, the last German units in the northern pocket surrendered. Of the roughly 250,000 men who had been encircled, about 35,000 had been evacuated by air. Some 60,000 had died in the pocket. Approximately 91,000 went into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The human cost, beyond the statistics numbers, can be numbing. When we say that more than 26 million Soviet citizens died during World War II, or that German casualties on the Eastern Front exceeded 5 million, these figures are so vast they become abstract. But behind every statistic was a person with a name, a family, hopes, and fears. The treatment of prisoners on the Eastern Front was particularly horrific. Hitler's Commissar Order of July 1941 mandated the immediate execution of Soviet political officers. More broadly, the Wehrmacht regarded the war in the East as a crusade against Bolshevism that wasn't bound by the normal rules of war. Approximately 2.8 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity between June 1941 and February 1942 alone, mostly through deliberate starvation and exposure. They were held in open-air camps with minimal shelter, given inadequate food, denied medical treatment, and often worked to death. The German treatment of Soviet civilians was equally brutal. The Sixth Army, while advancing through Ukraine, confiscated vast quantities of food for their own use, creating acute shortages for the civilian population. By January 1942, about a third of Kharkov's 300,000 remaining inhabitants were suffering from starvation. Civilians survived by making stews from boiled leather and sawdust, and omelets from coagulated blood. Many didn't survive the winter at all. The Sixth Army was also implicated in war crimes against Jewish populations. Under the command of Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, the army assisted SS Einsatzgruppen in rounding up Jewish communities for mass execution, including the massacre at Babi Yar, outside Kiev, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in September 1941. Reichenau issued his notorious severity order on October 10, 1941, instructing his soldiers to carry out harsh punishment of what he called the Jewish subhumanity. The Soviets, for their part, were equally brutal in their treatment of German prisoners, particularly after what they had witnessed of German behavior in occupied territories. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad, most would die in Soviet camps over the following months and years, from disease, malnutrition, and forced labor. Stalin's Order 270 in August 1941 had declared Soviet soldiers who surrendered to be traitors, and Order 227 in July 1942, the famous Not One Step Backward Order, authorized blocking detachments to shoot any Soviet soldiers who retreated without authorization. But amid all this organized brutality, there were also individual stories of humanity. A German corporal wrote a final letter to his family as the pocket at Stalingrad collapsed. "This is the last letter that I'll be able to send you. We've just been unlucky this time. If these lines are at home, then your son isn't here anymore. I mean, on this earth." It's a heartbreaking glimpse of a young man facing death, stripped of all the propaganda and ideology, just a human being saying goodbye. On the Soviet side, we have accounts like that of Yevdokia Dashina, a zookeeper in Leningrad who during the 900-day siege of that city hauled 40-liter barrels of water from the Neva River every day to keep Belle the hippopotamus alive, rubbing her with camphor oil when the pool dried up and her skin began to crack. It's a small story amid the vast tragedy, but it speaks to the human capacity for compassion even in the darkest circumstances. These personal stories remind us that the Eastern Front was not just a clash of armies and ideologies, but a human catastrophe on an almost incomprehensible scale. The approximately 1,710 towns and 70,000 villages that were completely annihilated in the Soviet Union were not just structures, but communities, homes, the fabric of people's lives. Each represented countless individual tragedies that no statistic can fully capture. The legacy of color. What these images preserve. The color footage and photographs from the Eastern Front hold a special place in historical documentation. Most of what we have from this period is in black and white, which, while valuable, creates a certain psychological distance. We've come to associate black and white imagery with the past, with history, with something fundamentally different from our present experience. Color collapses that distance. When we see a photograph of a German soldier in the summer of 1941 and can distinguish the different greens in the landscape, the dust on his uniform, the actual color of the sky above him, something shifts in our perception. This person existed in the same colorful world we inhabit? The psychological gap narrows, and history becomes more immediate, more real. The Agfa color footage represents a remarkable technological achievement for its time. In an era when color photography was still relatively rare and expensive, when most color processes required complicated development procedures, Agfa offered a relatively streamlined approach. The fact that the German propaganda services devoted precious resources to color photography speaks to the importance they placed on visual documentation and propaganda. But what's particularly valuable about this footage is what it captures beyond its intended propaganda purpose. Yes, the cameramen were there to show German strength and document German victories, but they also captured moments of weariness, uncertainty, and the sheer scale of what the German army was attempting. They documented the landscape, the weather, the faces of soldiers and civilians. These unintended documents are often more revealing than the carefully staged propaganda shots. The preservation of this footage also involved a complex post-war history. After Germany's defeat, various archives of German propaganda materials were captured by the Allied forces. American troops confiscated several trucks full of material from German propaganda units in 1945. This material eventually made its way to archives like the U.S. National Archives and the German Federal Archives. Some footage remained hidden for decades before being rediscovered and preserved. The color fidelity of Agfa color has held up remarkably well in many cases, though some footage shows the fading and color shifts that can occur with age. Modern restoration techniques have helped preserve and restore these images, ensuring that future generations can continue to study this visual record. For historians, this footage provides invaluable insights into aspects of the war that written records often miss. We can see the actual conditions soldiers faced, the type of equipment they used, the state of the roads and infrastructure, the appearance of villages and towns before they were destroyed. We can observe body language, facial expressions, and informal interactions that official reports wouldn't capture. The footage also serves as a reminder of the power of visual media to shape perception and memory. The German propaganda photographers were trying to create a specific narrative about the war. By examining what they chose to film and what they didn't, what they emphasized and what they downplayed, we can learn not just about the events themselves, but about how those events were portrayed and manipulated for propaganda purposes. Conclusion. Lessons from the Frozen Steppes. The German invasion of the Soviet Union stands as one of the most consequential military campaigns in human history. It was the largest land conflict ever fought, involving more soldiers, more territory, and resulting in more casualties than any other campaign of World War II, or indeed any war before or since. The Eastern Front was where the bulk of the Wehrmacht was committed, where the majority of German casualties occurred, and ultimately where the outcome of the war in Europe was decided. When we examine the color footage from this campaign, we're not just looking at historical curiosities. We're witnessing the visual record of how ambition, ideology, logistics, geography, weather, and human endurance collided in a struggle that would reshape the world. The confident German advance of June 1941 gave way to the grim defensive battles of winter, then the renewed offensive of 1942, and finally the catastrophe of Stalingrad that marked the beginning of Germany's long retreat. The lessons of the Eastern Front are numerous and profound. We see the dangers of ideological warfare that dehumanizes the enemy and discards the rules of civilized conflict. We witness the limits of even the most professional military machine when faced with inadequate logistics, hostile terrain, and an enemy fighting for survival. We observe how strategic overreach and political interference can undermine tactical brilliance. We learn that even the most advanced technology and tactics can be defeated by determination, sacrifice, and the willingness to trade space for time. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the human cost of war. The more than 26 million Soviet citizens who died, the millions of German soldiers who never returned home, the destroyed cities and villages, the orphaned children, the widowed spouses, the broken families. The color footage brings us face to face with the reality that these were real people who lived through these events, not abstract figures in a history book. These images also remind us of the importance of historical documentation and preservation. Without the work of those propaganda cameramen, without the archivists who preserved this footage, without the historians and technicians who have restored and digitized it, we would have lost this window into the past. Every piece of preserved historical material, every photograph, every letter, every diary entry adds to our understanding of what happened and why it matters. As we watch this rare color footage of the German advance through the Soviet Union, we should remember that we're witnessing history not as it was written, but as it was lived. We see the faces of young men far from home, caught up in events beyond their control. We see landscapes transformed by war. We see the machinery of modern warfare deployed across vast distances. And we see, in the colors that bring these images to life, a reminder that history isn't something that happened in some distant, monochrome past. It happened to real people, in full color, in a world that looked very much like ours. If this deep dive into one of World War II's most pivotal campaigns has given you a new perspective on history, if these rare color images have helped bring the past to life in a meaningful way, then please consider supporting this channel by hitting that like button and subscribing. There's so much more history to explore together, so many more stories waiting to be told, so many more lessons to learn from those who came before us. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.